According to the French spiritual writers, we must be an extension of the incarnate life of Christ on earth, living His life. How well we live Christ's life on earth will be proportional to how we will reflect His glory after this life. Our Lady, as the Immaculate Conception, was perfectly conformed to the image of Christ from the start. Since we are not conceived without sin, we certainly need her to help us, but it is also good to look to other saints who reached this perfect transformation into Christ and learn how to conform to that image of Christ, which we do not yet perfectly have. According to Pope Leo XIII, St. Francis of Assisi was the complete model of Christian perfection. We will now look to St. Francis of Assisi, whom Our Lady made so much like Christ that he was even physically like Christ in the wounds on his hands, feet, and side, but most importantly in his virtues. St. Francis was born in Assisi in the year 1182 to Pietro de Bernardone de Moriconi and Pica de Bolemon. While in labor, his mother Pica could not give birth to Francis until she was brought to an animal stable, so that Francis would be like Christ, even in his birth. He grew up learning to be a merchant like his father. He was a foolish young man, but is said to have never committed one mortal sin. He fought in a battle against Perugia around 1202, and after being imprisoned at Collestrada for 1 year, was released to find himself ill. This illness began to stir an awareness in his heart that this world is passing away. After regaining his strength, he began preparing to follow a nobleman to Apulia on a military expedition to become a knight. After packing his things, he had a vision of a room full of armor and a beautiful bride. He awoke with excitement, thinking he was about to prosper in his worldly endeavors. After this experience, Francis, while half asleep, heard someone ask him where he was going. Francis replied with an explanation about his efforts to become a knight, and then received the following question: "Is it better to be rewarded by the master or the servant?" Francis responded, "The master." The heavenly voice continued, "Then why are you leaving the master for the servant? The rich lord for the poor man?" Francis, after this Pauline-like experience, had to face a serious question, whether he would serve God or Mammon. He realized he could not have both at the same time. Soon after this, he rebuilt the church of St. Damian, having heard the Crucifix there speak to him, where Christ asked him to help rebuild his church, which was falling into ruins. It was clear later to Francis that Christ did not mean a physical church building, but literally the Catholic Church founded on St. Peter. Francis eventually strips himself naked in front of the bishop as a sign of his putting on the new man, left his earthly father for the love of our Heavenly Father, and began to live the life of Christ in a real and manly way, as a knight for his Creator and Heavenly King. He lived a life of strict poverty and begging, which soon attracted many followers. His first disciples were 12 in number, as Christ had 12 apostles. One of these first friars, Brother Giovanni, eventually left and hanged himself like Judas. The first one to follow Francis was a certain Bernard. Hear how Bernard decided to take on such a life. One night, Francis was taken in by Bernard, who gave him a bed in his own room. Francis went to bed and pretended to sleep, so that Bernard thought he was asleep. When Francis thought Bernard was sleeping, hearing his loud snores, he got up to pray. Bernard, who was also pretending to sleep, saw Francis in prayer, saying over and over again, "My God and my all." This experience was enough to inspire Bernard to leave all things behind and follow this humble saint. It did not take long for Francis to attract many followers, so that his friars numbered in the thousands when he died, 5,000. We will now look at Francis' life as a friar to see how much it was like the life of Christ in his public ministry. While he is known as the saint who stressed the need to respect God's creation at times, he was not the nature fanatic he is made out to be. Ironically, he actually wrote in one of his first rules for his friars a prohibition from even having animals in common. The reason why he was delighted to see God's creation was because he knew the purpose of these creatures, that is, the glory of God. There was one time when a certain lamb would follow Francis and the friars into church and kneel before the altar of Our Lady of the Lamb, bleating while the friars chanted the divine office. And at Mass, the lamb would bow and bend its knees during the elevation. It seems to me an extraordinary thing like this was meant to chide men for their lukewarmness. Just like Jesus, Francis worked many miracles and even cast out devils. There once was a leper for whom the friars were caring in a certain hospital, who was so insulting in his language towards them and his blasphemy against Christ and his mother, and he was constantly whipping the friars so that many thought he was possessed. When his blasphemies against Jesus and Mary got so bad that the friars abandoned him so as not to be a cause for his blaspheming, Francis himself, hearing of the situation, came to visit the man. The man did nothing but complain, but Francis bore this with meekness, returning words of peace. Realizing the leper's affliction by an evil spirit, Francis left the man to pray. On coming back, he offered to care for him himself, to which the leper reluctantly agreed. Francis told him he would do for him whatever he wanted to help him in his affliction of body. The man asked Francis to wash his body as it was horribly stinky. Wherever Francis cleaned, the leper's flesh was made whole. At the same time, tears of compunction began to flow from the leper's eyes as he mourned for his sins. St. Francis, seeing the miracle that took place, just like Christ, fleeing the crowds who wanted to make him king, fled immediately so as to hide from any excited people. 15 days later, the cured leper, having done penance, fell ill and died a holy death after being anointed. He then appeared to St. Francis, who was praying at the time, and thanked him, to tell him he was in heaven. On another occasion, when Francis came to Rieti, he went to a church outside the town. So many people came to see him that the vineyard of the priest at the church was trampled and destroyed. The priest regretted letting Francis come to his church. Francis knew the priest's thoughts and asked him how many measures of wine the vineyard would produce in good situations. The priest said 12. Francis replied, asking the priest if he could continue staying at the church, and if the people could continue to take grapes from the destroyed vineyard for love of God. He also promised the priest that if he agreed to this, the vineyard would produce 20 measures of wine during the year. Sure enough, the priest, agreeing with Francis, saw 20 measures of the best wine that year at vintage time. Having considered Francis' conformity to Christ in his miracles and his direct influence in the lives of others, let us now consider his conformity to Christ in his suffering and his own personal life with God. It is said that Francis experienced the dark night of the soul for 10 years. Work of a physical nature is hard. Work of an intellectual nature is even harder, but the spiritual life is the hardest, and therefore the manliest work there is. When a man embraces penance, prayer, and suffering for the love of God, not for what he will get out of it, you have what is called a true man. This was St. Francis of Assisi, especially on Mount Alverna. He went to this mountain to pray and prepare himself for death in a cell he made for himself. Not long after arriving on this mountain, Francis was outside contemplating his surroundings, when it was revealed to him by heaven that the large chasms he beheld at that moment were created by the earthquake that happened at the death of his divine master. This was all it took to begin his ultimate crucifixion on that mountain. He began to experience the greatest spiritual consolations and even levitated under the watch of his special companion, Brother Leo. Sometimes Francis was so high in the air and radiated so much that Brother Leo could hardly see him. Since his fast in honor of St. Michael was approaching, which would begin on the Feast of the Assumption, Francis, growing even deeper in his contemplations, wanted an even more isolated place to pray and fast. Brother Leo helped him make a hut in a more hidden place, to which place Francis would only allow Leo to come if, on calling Francis, he replied. He said this because sometimes his prayer was so intense that he could not speak or feel anything for a day and a night at a time. In this new place of solitude, Francis became more involved in serious penance and even had physical attacks from the devil. When a man is determined, he knows how to get what he wants. Francis wanted Christ in him crucified, and this he got. While Francis was weakening in body due to his fasts, for consolation he once began to meditate on the life of the saints in heaven. He prayed to taste their joy. An angel then appeared to him with a violin and drew the bow one time across it. Francis was so consoled that he thought he would die if the angel continued. The crucifixion of Francis was nearing even faster, and one time Brother Leo heard Francis praying repetitively, "Who are you, my dearest God, and what am I, your vilest little worm and useless servant?" Then, as God is attracted by humility, Leo saw a torch of fire come out of heaven and rest on the holy head of St. Francis. He heard God's voice come out of the flame and speak with Francis, followed by Francis holding his hand out 3 times to the flame. The torch then returned to heaven. During this time, as Francis later told Brother Leo, God asked him to give him 3 gifts. Francis replied, humbly asking what to offer, since all he had was his habit. God said, "Put your hand in your bosom and offer me whatever you find there." Francis, doing what he was told, pulled out a large coin and offered it to the Almighty. This happened 3 times in all. Francis knew immediately that these 3 coins were poverty, chastity, and obedience. And the evangelical counsels which make the baptized soul most like Christ when fully lived in the religious state. Now, on the day before the feast of the exaltation of the cross, an angel appeared to Francis, as an angel appeared to Christ in the Garden of Olives on the day before his crucifixion. This angel said, "I encourage you and urge you to prepare and to dispose yourself humbly to receive with all patience what God wills to do in you." Francis replied that he was ready to bear whatever his Lord wanted. Finally, his Good Friday came. On September 14th, 1224, the feast of the Holy Cross, the exaltation of the Holy Cross, Francis faced the east and prayed that before he died, he would be given the grace to suffer in soul and body the passion of Christ, and feel the great love of Christ's heart which moved him to suffer for sinners. Not long after, a crucified seraph came out of heaven, which sight moved Francis to joy and sorrow, as it were, at the same time. Nearby farmers later said they saw a fire on the mountain, which was so bright that some people thought the sun had already risen. After this vision in which Christ told Francis of his desire that he be his standard-bearer, Francis soon discovered the wounds of Christ appear in his hands, feet, and side. Nails even appeared in his hands and feet, so as to cause him great pain in walking, for which he needed special sandals. Thus was Francis crucified. When Francis came down the mountain, he performed many miracles with his stigmata, such as the time when he was traveling with a man in the cold. On this occasion, when stopping for the night, the man began to cry out and blame Francis for his having to sleep in such cold weather. Francis touched the man with his wounded hand, and a great warmth immediately inundated the man's body. Need we speak of his bodily death? All we must say is that just as he was like Christ in his birth, life, and crucifixion, so was he like Christ in his death. He had the friars lay him naked on the ground so that he could die like Christ. Francis died in 1226 and was canonized in 1228, 2 years later. It seems Christ's church is once again falling into ruins, and we are in need of not a few walking crucifixes like St. Francis.